This is Synopsis, a series of conversations with composers in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Neža Zupanc, and today's guest is Jason Carl Rosenberg. Jason, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. It's so nice to be here. I am a composer and music cognition researcher, and I am currently in a artist residency in Minnesota, where I'm very honored to be invited here to work on my music while in this incredible space. But it's an honor to be here with you and to talk about my compositions and about compositional process.
Wonderful. If you will wish, feel free to share what you're currently working on. And before that, also, I wanted to ask you, what led you to composition? How did you arrive to the beginning of it? How did you start composing?
I started composing, like many other kids my age, mostly through garage bands and just playing in like pop punk kind of bands when I was a young kid, and just writing songs and just playing tons of covers on like my guitar and with friends playing. And we were absolutely atrociously bad, just awful, just the worst possible, playing like Nirvana riffs and thinking, like we're a pretty good song. We have no idea what you're doing. You just keep moving your hands around until something sounds good and you're like, ooh, I like the sound of that. And then you move it and you just play a whole bunch of covers. You keep practicing and practicing, learning more and more songs. And then, someone teaches you there's a new chord and you're like, ooh, a D7, how do I play that? And it's so funny how every new chord feels like a revelation. And it was before internet days, and so you had to kind of learn either with a book or with a friend, normally a friend who kind of shows you something that it's like, oh, he knows how to play guitar better than we do. And so then you learn a little bit of that. And so, yeah, most of my early, what I would call compositions, even though they're not written down, but I feel like songs are certainly part of that process. And so, yeah, it was just writing a whole bunch of pop songs and of different styles, especially like punk ska, punk, sort of poppy kind of punk. And yeah, so that's how it got started. But I was a saxophonist as my main instrument. And so I played saxophone in all the school bands and the jazz bands and things like that. And yeah, I feel that I think like many other kids in America, your first opportunities to write are for those ensembles, like those high school ensembles. And so that's how I started. I would just write for my like saxophone quartet or like the jazz band or things like this. And I also wrote just a lot of stuff that was just for MIDI playback, just in very simple, it wasn't even finale or notation programs that are sophisticated, like free, very simple freeware kind of music notation programs where you could just take your mouse and move a note up or down and keep doing that again and again. And because I had so little music theory knowledge, it was all trial and error. I would just like move notes around, hit spacebar, listen to it for a little while and be like, ooh, that sounded terrible. Let's move it to another note, hit spacebar, get to that one spot again and be like, oh, that sounded pretty nice. And just add little chunks, little bit by little bit, trial and error, and somehow this process of self-discovery and taking chances and just seeing what comes out without really knowing why, almost kind of learning theory through, note by note discovery, and just making songs that way that I never had intended to have it performed by real musicians. It was just really for playback, and then I would make it so that something sounded what I thought was nice in my 15-year-old mind. And then I would play it for my family and they would go like, oh, it's so good. They're slightly biased. And I remember my grandmother, who had some training at Juilliard and was a trained singer. She would be the most critical of my family members. And she would say, Jason, have you thought about maybe repeating some ideas so that it isn't just one idea after another idea after another idea, but maybe bring some things around again, And I remember thinking, oh yeah, I guess I could try that, you know? Like this whole idea of like maybe I should have like, you know, some kind of repeatability or, you know, have something that is returnable and that could be remembered. And anyway, so then, yeah, then once I started doing that, she's like, okay, that's good. Now, like, you keep now just repeating things over and over. Like, how could you incorporate variability? You know, and all these things, you know, kind of learning this process of how to write based on just trying things and doing it without having a formalized theory or composition program or teacher or classes, just really just doing it. And through that process, I just thought it was the most fun, interesting, and wickedly difficult thing I had ever done. I felt like, you know, I would be like up all night long until like, you know, I would start doing it in the day. And then I would find myself like at like 4 o'clock in the morning as like a 15-year-old being like, oh, I'm still going with this. And, you know, but just kind of feeling hooked on it. And then feeling the sense of accomplishment when it was over, but also constantly feeling like, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing, but it's so cool to keep learning. And so between playing in bands, writing music for ensembles like saxophone quartets and things like that, and then writing all this computer music, I just began to kind of morph them all together as this is what writing music means. Like in all these different ways, they can all coexist, but they all help each other in creating something that might be called a craft. And then I went to college for aeronautical engineering, not music. Yeah, and I was always a math and science kid, and music was just a passion project. I was always deeply involved in music, but it was not what I imagined I would be doing professionally. But then by the time I went to college and I was involved, I was, you know, taking classes, I decided I really wanted to try doing music composition, spending more time in classes doing it. And then I won a pretty great award as an undergrad that gave me this confidence, or maybe a false sense of confidence, that maybe I could do this as a career. And so I still have a degree in math, but I also have a degree in music from my undergraduate program from New College of Florida. And and then after that, I went to grad school in music. And I also was still doing music and science, so I still continued doing science-related things while in grad school. At the same time, I was getting my master's and Ph.D. in music composition and theory. I was also working at a place called the Neurosciences Institute in La Jolla, California. And so I was involved in both of these things. So throughout my entire life, there's never been a time really when I wasn't doing both science and math and music. They both have always existed in my life, and I feel very lucky and happy to say that I've somehow managed to make a career where I'm still doing both of those things.
Yes, and I guess we can go straight into the next question, which is, how tightly connected do you see, or how big do you see the possibility of expanding the discoveries of neuroscience through music? You do have some work done in that area, if I read correctly some of your work.
Not only have you read it, you've been involved in it.
Yes, I know.
Like, this is a unique situation. Yeah, you're like playing it off like, oh, I read it somewhere. Like, you're playing it off like you haven't been involved in some ways. So Neža, for those, I
wanted to get to that also.
Yeah, well, maybe do you want to say what you did in my for my piece?
I mean, I actually refreshed as I was preparing for this conversation. I actually refreshed on what we did as we recorded the Negentropy, your composition for flute solo. And I don't know whether I forgot or I just saw that only the two flautists organized the structure differently? Because for anyone without context, the piece has different sections, and it's up to actually your experiment was about individuals with professionals in music and non-professionals in music organizing these sections. So the order was up to these individuals, and so something over 70% organized it in the expected way. Is that correct? And 2 didn't, that is the rest of the percentage didn't, and those 2 were actually the 2 people that performed the piece. So you connected the way of organizing to the amount of times someone plays it, or the how do you say how much someone is familiarized with the composition, right?
Yeah, so maybe I think that was a great synopsis, if you will. Yeah, so it's almost right. I'll just revise a few small things. So the piece is for solo flute, and it's in 9 sections that could be ordered in whatever way. So it can be sequenced in any possible way of those 9 sections. And it's designed as a concert piece that could be just performed on a typical concert. And it was also used for a set of experiments for scientific pursuits. Mm-hmm. And so the concert part of it is pretty straightforward. A performer can just decide to choose which order that they want these 9 sections to be in, and they can omit up to 3 of those sections. So if they want, they could have it be as short as 6 sections long, but they can also do all 9, and they get to choose for themselves which order to have it, which sequence of these 9 sections. For the experiment, the scientific experiment, I had listeners be able to hear those 9 sections, repeat them over and over again as many times as they want, characterize them, so I get to actually see what kinds of things they wrote about them. But then mostly the point was to see how did they sequence them. Mm-hmm. And so I had a number of people do this, and they were grouped into either professional composers. So I had, being a professional composer is nice because I know a lot of other professional composers. And so I've just asked a whole bunch of people that I know in the field and said, hey, can you be involved in this experiment? And so I got a collection of professional composers that did this experiment where they sequenced these 9 sections. And then I got a collection of people that have almost no musical experience whatsoever. They've never studied an instrument. They would call themselves, non-musicians for sure. And so 2 extreme groups, total professionals that devote their entire life to music, and people that have never studied music. Mm-hmm. So these are the 2 groups. And I was expecting these groups to order these 9 sections very differently. That would be, I think, most people's expectations. That would, you would expect that the types of things that composers would do would be perhaps maybe more adventurous or more, they would attach certain types of forms that might be a little bit more challenging, or who knows. But I would just expect there to be differences no matter what. Mm-hmm. And to my surprise, there was general alignment with how these 2 very different groups sequenced these 9 sections. And so that was shocking. And so the basic takeaway, too long didn't read, is that they basically all made kind of an arch form where it starts with lower intensity sections and then builds to higher intensity and then back again to lower intensity. So kind of like soft, loud, soft, or something along those lines. I like to use intensity because they're not loud and soft, but that kind of arch form. And I did further experiments with other participants to measure how intense each section is on a slider, so I could actually measure the intensity on some kind of empirical way, and then mapped that to show that there's a pretty strong arch form in these very different groups. Mm-hmm. So that was the takeaway. But then, as Nežo was saying, that there are outliers, that we're not involved in the experiments, but that it's just a very interesting observation that the performers that have performed the piece, who get to know it better than anyone besides, I guess, me, but they get to, they have to work on these pieces, and it's a challenging piece. Like, it takes a while to learn it. And so they get to know it really, really well. And their sequences have always not been an arch form. They have something idiosyncratic, something unique. And this is, I think, really interesting, almost as if, the more you get to know something, the materials, the more maybe perhaps adventurous you might be. And this might be even true for professional composers. If they're newly exposed to something, and they might just tend to create something that might be the safest way, but having intimate familiarity with something maybe allows you to be, to create more surprises, to challenge the norms of formal structural expectations. And so I think this is one of the most exciting things. So two big takeaways from that one project one was that composers and non-musicians seem to have the same kind of preference when shown the same kind of sequence or the same kind of musical material, but the people that know it really well don't follow that. So I think it's really cool.
It seems fascinating, since just recently I've been realizing that the first encounters were, I know this is like generally perhaps almost abused discourse about liking or not liking new music, and I wouldn't really submit to those terms, although at that point, with my first encounters at the college, when my colleague who was a composer was like, could you play this flute part, and I was like, of course. And that was the first time that I could find this music, which was, let's say, very atonal. It had microtonality in it. First time I had to play, bisbigliandos and quarter notes. And at first it really seemed a bit horrible, and how then, with all the repetitions that are demanded from someone that performs a composition, got me to a place where, and again, as perhaps banal this sounds now, but I said, but this is actually really nice, and it got me thinking how much repetition and, as you said, intimate familiarity, knowledge of a piece, actually, what role does that play in a human's perception of what is music, what is beautiful, what is melodical, what sounds nice. Again, it comes to sort of taste, but also perception of this. So it's really curious. Have you worked further into this at any point?
Not with my own research directly, but I think you're absolutely correct. I would completely agree with you that familiarity with some music or some ideas are going to have a very powerful effect on how much you like it. There's a pretty strong positive correlation between how much you listen to something and how much you like it. This isn't always the case, of course, but there is a strong overall positive correlation. And, even like when I think about going to weddings and people are dancing, it's like the dance time to everyone dances. They almost always play really familiar songs, because if someone knows a song, they're far more likely to go like, oh, I love that song. And they get up and they want to dance to it, because they know, they not only know the words and, the beat, but they can predict how it's going to be. And yeah, there's a strong link between how much they know the song and how much they say that they like it. Theodor Adorno from the Frankfurt School of Philosophy calls this the fetishization of the familiar. And he riled against it, trying to use this argument, use this observation that that we have this fetish for familiar pieces and familiar ideas. And so he talks about this in music and uses this as an example of why we need to be listening to, as a society and culture, music that challenges these repeated norms and the same songs over and over and over and over again. You know, like hearing the same Beethoven pieces at every concert, or the same. And he was really going against the record player and how we just repeat the same songs, or the radio stations that just repeat the same songs over and over and over again. And so he was really challenging those kinds of notions. I don't agree with him completely, but I do agree that there is a massive preference for things that are familiar. And so when we look at new music, like anything else, the more that you get immersed into that sonic space, the more you get to learn about all the techniques and the structures, all the components that make that style or that collection of styles that thing, and that you know what to expect, you know what to listen for, you know how to accurately predict what is going to happen, and the enjoyment of having those predictions come true or not coming true, like being thwarted, like you're expecting something. There's like tremendous joy and pleasure from having an expectation and then it being thwarted. But that only comes if you can make predictions. And you can only really make predictions if you know that kind of music well enough to do so. And I think this is true for any unfamiliar pieces, like any unfamiliar styles. Like if you never listen to heavy metal, but then the first time you only listen to it once, you may not be into it. But if you really immerse yourself and you start playing it and you're involved in it, and you start to listen to all the different styles and different bands, and you start making preferences, and then before you know it, you can really appreciate the art form. And I think that's true with any normally unfamiliar music, music that's unfamiliar to you as an individual. So new music is like that, but you could argue that new music is maybe a little bit more challenging to create predictions than other types of music, because it's such a large umbrella term that fits so many different types of music. And I do think that is true. It is, the category of new music is, like the category of pop music or something. It's like, there's so many types of subgenres. And so not all those pieces have to, have atonal elements or microtones and things that you mentioned. Those a lot of new music has that, but it doesn't have to in new music. And so the diversity of new music does, I think, add an extra layer of challenge, an extra layer of becoming familiar. And I think that's part of the reason why the people that are typically most into new music are people who are professionals, that don't just listen to it every once in a while, but hear it much more frequently, that they are involved in it, that they've played it, that their friends are doing it, that they're writing it, or whatever it might be. That there's like this commitment in some way to it, and a deep familiarity that can really only come with enough hours of exposure.
And since the compositional practice is the main subject of this conversation, does then familiarity with what you know, in terms of structuring your own compositional practice, what role does it play, the familiarity, if any role? How do you conceive of it when you compose? And also, what are the other parts of this practice as you compose?
So I understood the first question. I don't know if I understood the second question, but I can answer the first one.
Okay.
The first part about my practice doing composition and maybe what it means for composers to be writing it and how that affects familiarity. Obviously, if you spend huge numbers of hours in a sonic space trying to create something, of course you're going to get more and more immersed in it and familiar with the fine nuances of that sonic world. But there's also, there are cultural forces at play. You know, it is not just what's going on in my head or in one's head. It's there's a reason why so many, let's say, composers that are in universities training to write music tend to be influenced by a collection of styles of music, a fairly small collection of styles of music often the new music box. And that's because there are realities of what is popular at the time for different subgroups, and why those are popular, and why and what kind of cultural factors are creating the spaces where we want to be in that sonic space. So I feel like I don't know if hopefully I'm answering the question the way that maybe you intended it, but for me, the familiarity and the reason why someone like a composer like myself would be interested in doing it and how I would do it is because not only my own huge number of hours writing music and spending time with that material and listening to it and going to concerts and being exposed and being part of a community, but that there is a community, and that community is created by very complex means of power and cultural factors and forces that shape what we do, and those forces influence the music that we listen to and the music that we want to play. And yeah, I think all these things happen. So I think there's a coexistence between internal forces and external forces, and yeah, so I'm convinced that one of the reasons I got into new music and why I was writing it, especially particularly interested when I was younger, and as a grad student, for instance, is because there is a sort of cultural cachet of this music, and you want to feel like you fit in, and that you are doing something that feels relevant and that feels exciting and adventurous. And so yeah, all of these things influence why we become very familiar with this particular kind of umbrella, music within this certain umbrella, and why I become so familiar with it. So yeah, so that's my internal, external feelings on it. What was the second question that you were asking? I don't know if I caught it.
Second question is more in the direction of different of your conception of what compositional practice is. And what I was saying was, I assume then this knowledge of not only familiarity as you addressed it now, which is more wider and let's say from a, as you said, cultural standpoint, more familiarity is in what you did in research in negentropy, as in what does one expect, let's say, with how something is received. What will someone be expecting when hearing your composition performance? And next to that, the question is more like, what are the parts of your composition practice as you conceive it, such as perhaps after your grandma gave you the remarks, you started working more on structure, or is that form for you? And these kind of realms of the compositional practice you do.
Yeah, those are some big questions. The part about prediction and expectation, I think, is a really fascinating one. There's a book by David Huron called Sweet Anticipation, and it's I don't know, it may be published about 20 years ago now, but it was very influential when it came out, because it talked about music in the brain and how and combined a bunch of new research on how we use prediction in musical contexts and how that affects emotion. And it presented these things in a very approachable way so that a general audience member could read it. And And one of the great big takeaways from that book is that there is this sweet anticipation. There's this great reward that has strong positive emotional qualities when you predict something and then it is achieved or not achieved. Both of them create different amounts of enjoyment in different ways, in different contexts. But yeah, we do this all the time. Even we do this in language, right? So some of my research involves prediction with music and how it compares with the prediction in language. Yes. And there's something called the cloze probability. That's CLOZE. And cloze probability describes the probability of a word to appear next in a sentence. So for instance, if I said the sentence, the boy went outside to fly a, and then the next word, there's maybe an 80% chance that the word kite would show up. The boy went outside to fly a kite. And a very small close probability that the word cow would come up. So we could talk about...
The kite is a dragon. So I was like, dragon.
Yeah, dragon. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Well, and...
Out of context. Well, yeah. We just call it the same thing. Yeah.
And in Ljubljana, I mean, dragons are everywhere. So you can't help but think about dragons there.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes, the land of dragons. Yeah, I mean, the kites are called dragons in some languages, right?
At least in Slovenian, if I'm.
In Slovenian, it's called dragon, like
yeah,
basically.
It's the light little thing. Depends.
Mm-hmm.
How big on a long.
A string.
Row. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. So basically, you can create a model to predict how likely a word is going to show up. And this is called the cloze probability. And just means like how likely a particular word is going to show up. And you can do the same thing with melodies. If you have a melody, dum, 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 then you're likely to go, da, on the next one. And, finish like this, kind of authentic 5-1 kind of cadence and bring it back to the tonic. And so we can create different possibilities in music as well. And we can look at how these things can compare. And that is what I have one paper that is about this exact topic. And actually, we're about to submit a second paper on it where we're doing the same thing, but using EEG imaging studies to look at it. So the first one is a behavioral study, then we have an imaging study. So anyway, it's going to be this is still ongoing, like what we're working on. But it's important to say, with all this talk about anticipation and prediction, is that these are very like low-hanging fruit, neurologically speaking, right? Like this is a young field, and the techniques that we have and the kinds of questions that we are able to ask and try to answer are very, at least scientifically, are very simple, rudimentary. Like we're asking, questions that don't really get at the large, complex issues that are involved in prediction in music. So for instance, in that exact case I sang a single melody. But what happens when you have a much more complex case with lots of different, instruments going on and different timbres and different, intensities and lots of, like it gets significantly harder. And so, unfortunately, we have to start small, and this is a young field still. And so we're asking very simple questions right now. Ones that are often not particularly relevant for composers. So I don't know if any composer is going to be listening to this right now, but they're thinking, "Ooh, how can I use this new research on prediction to influence what kind of music I write?" I think at this point we're not really there yet on having it be something that in my opinion, I could be, everyone has a different opinion, but in my opinion, it's probably not, the science is not at the point where it could be particularly useful for composers, especially writing non-traditional music, especially, because it's all normally within tonal context. But it is relevant for computer models. So we worked with a group at MIT that used the melodies that I wrote, a collection of melodies that have different levels of predictability and closed probability. And we tried to have this computer model determine, guess what notes might come next based on the previous melody. And it aligned very strongly with human prediction as well. And so it can be used in interesting ways to basically improve AI and allow these kinds of models and prediction actually are very useful from a computer programming standpoint, and do teach us something about how humans think and how humans create prediction based on harmonic patterns and melodic figurations. But I just want to stress that they're pretty rudimentary at this point. Mm-hmm. The second thing you were saying about how all these things maybe about my compositional practice and maybe how these things influence how I conceive of music, perhaps, is that mm-hmm. a fair way of summarizing? It's a complex thing. One of the reasons that I got into so I went to grad school. I said this, I went to grad school at UC San Diego, and while I was there, I started working at the Neurosciences Institute. And the reason I got involved is because a scientist there was looking for someone who could be his assistant for a project, someone with a math and science background, but that is also a musician. And I applied and I was selected. And the reason, and his name is Ani Patel, and we've been working, Anirudh Patel, and he's now at Tufts, but we've been working together since 2002. So he's like
also
by far.
wrote an article together, right?
Yeah, we have like almost everything I've ever worked on scientifically, I've done with him. He's like he was my mentor, but he's still, I guess, my mentor in most ways. But he's also just a good friend and my main scientific collaborator for sure. Mm-hmm. And I think he's wonderful and brilliant and kind and just a delight. But before I even got to know him and know if I would like working with him and for him and being his lab assistant, research assistant, I thought it might be a good idea to spend a significant time doing music cognition and music neuroscience research, because not only do I have a science background, and I thought I would be, it'd be relevant to my experience and I'd be good at it. But more importantly, I thought it was going to really influence what I would do as a composer, as an artist, as a creative. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping to merge my understanding of the brain and have that really impact in some deep ways what I'm doing as a composer. There are times when that is true. And the Negentropy project that you were involved with, mm-hmm. That you played, I think is a good example of this, where I really am trying to find ways to create music that isn't just for, that is very simplified for scientific experiments, like those closed probability ones, which are just simple melodies, tonal melodies, but like creating something that I would create, the type of music I would want to create independent of science, and then find ways to create something that fits both worlds, that is fulfilling as an artistic project and is fulfilling as a science project. But it's very difficult to find those kinds of things. And the truth is, if I'm being real, is that a lot of the science and our understandings of the brain through science is, again, at a pretty low level of understanding, and that it often doesn't really influence me as an artist, that it's incredibly fascinating and absolutely wonderful to learn, and it's exciting, and it's building the foundations of our understanding about the brain that we can then build upon, and it's super important, and I love it all, and yet it often doesn't feel like it's particularly relevant to me as an artist, which is really trying to push boundaries that that most science experiments are not coming close to. So I would say there's only one. I don't know, one. That's just too reductive. But certainly one big takeaway for me that has influenced on science, that has influenced what I do as an artist, is to be, I would say, more reasonable, or lower sounds insulting, but I'm going to just say it, lower expectations of what I might expect listeners to be able to discern, especially upon first listening of a piece. So, I was trying to do all these very complex things that might have been, in my mind, very important to the piece and how I was conceiving of it. And while I don't want to give up doing really beautifully complex, deep, structural things that form, there's beauty in the structural components I wouldn't want to let go of, and I still am interested in. I have different approaches to what I'm hoping that listeners might hear, and find different patterns they might find. And so I guess.
But then again,
I'm not simplifying, but
everything, right?
Oh, no, for sure. And you always want, I think every creator, not just, composers, but like artists that are really trying to do things, they're trying to work on multiple levels at the same time. And I'm doing that just like pretty much everyone else. It's just that I now probably spend more time on the surface structural components, or surface level issues, and trying to make things a little bit more obvious than. That's probably the better. Not surface level. That sounds doesn't sound right. But I'm trying to make things more obvious and clear and direct, so that it is something that more people can latch onto. Yeah, I think I often think of myself when I'm writing music, and like what kind of music I want to hear and experience. But I also think about certain individuals that are in my life, that when I'm writing music, I'm often thinking of like particular people. Like I'm writing this as almost like a love letter, to someone that I love. And I'm thinking about what their experience is going to be like. And so it's not really for a general audience member. I'm often thinking about like someone particular, and when I do this, I'm thinking about it in ways that I'm hoping that they can find meaning in ways that align with my intentions. And sometimes that, and things that I don't intend to. But I also want that balance of creating things that they can predict and that they can experience and witness.
And discern out of the performance, out of music then, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's curious then, and that means you have very specific messages. Could I say messages, or just things in music that you want to be recognized?
Yes. Yeah, I'm okay. Messages is an interesting word. Yeah, but I know, but with I understand what you mean. And yeah, messages is kind of true, because messages doesn't have to have semantics, and it doesn't have to be a clear message. Like, we can have a message, like if someone winks at someone else, that could be a message, right? And there could be multiple interpretations based on different contexts and all these things. But you're still probably having some form of communication that has meaning. And if we consider that a message, communication with meaning, then yeah, I am trying to communicate particular things. And within the context of music, which doesn't have, which is this semantic-less collection of sounds and time. but there still is the possibility of meaningful communication within that. And yeah, I think one of the beauties of music is this simultaneity between collective forces and meaning and communication, right? I mean, you couldn't argue that there's no messages or communication in music when you go to a concert and everyone's jumping at the same time or clapping at the same time, or like there is.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something I feel is really special about music. Like what other forms of really anything, of any kind of art, of any kind of practice within the entire animal world, do you have this kind of collective understanding of what is happening in real time? You know, there's not a lot of examples that could challenge it. And so clearly there are, this rhythmic entrainment that we entrain to the beat, and that has this huge rhythmic force, but also with harmony and, the cadences and knowing when, something is going to come. And even like when you go to a dance club and like you hear a rise, a riser, and then you hear like, oh, the beat's about to drop, and then it drops, and everyone's kind of predicting, oh, is it going to drop now? And like, you're making these predictions, and then it drops, and then, everyone goes crazy. Like this can only happen if there is communication, right? There's something that we are all collectively hearing at the same time. And so I love the collective element of communication as a almost magical, mystical force of music. This is, we do study this in science, but it is, it is absolutely one of those things that I think is what draws a lot of us to music, is that collective force. But then there's also the individual that is creating their own connections, their own messages, their own meanings. And I think what attracts me so much is this simultaneity between the collective communication forces that exist in music and the individual communicative forces that exist in music. And I think that music is so intensely powerful and personal because of this simultaneity.
Wow. And it's curious because this magical and mystical forces, to take your words, at the same time, as you said, so easily provable on these cases of, as you said, in a nightclub, everyone dancing or jumping at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you can usually get proof of this on these very simple cases, and then the question is, until which point can you trace that as the music gets more, I don't want to say complex, but just applies different more unexpected elements, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's then the question, until where can you trace that? Because at some point it seems this exists, this recognition can exist on this example, but then you think of a different music and it seems impossible to recognize it there, yet it is there. So I guess that's what you're speaking to when you're saying that neuroscience at this point is such beginnings in this area that for composers it's not that useful just yet.
For me, it hasn't been.
Yeah.
And again, everyone's different. I'm not going to try to knock all the amazing work that scientists are doing.
Yeah.
But yes, so you're getting to these kind of questions of how much collective alignment is there when music doesn't have regularity and consistency, and when the music is less predictable. This is I think one of the things that pushes so many people away from things like new music, is that it doesn't have this in many cases, in most of the cases even, and that there's a spectrum, right? Like you can have music, Yeah, you can have music that is like completely 100% predictable, and most people would find that incredibly boring. Like it's not interesting. And then you can have music that is so unpredictable that it also usually has very little interest for people, because it's just, there's nothing to hold on to. And usually the sweet spot for people is somewhere in the middle. But how much in the middle is, everyone is different on, like everyone's unique. How complex do you like how spicy do you like your food? Or how complex do you like your books? Like everyone's different. And so new music has typically it sits on one side of that spectrum, typically. And that impacts the type of ways, the methods that you listen to it. How often have you gone to a new music concert and everyone wants to dance and stand up and move? Not as often. And that's often because there isn't this collective, as much of a collective force, and certainly not as much rhythmic entrainment, and there isn't as much predictability. And that makes it very hard to move, or even to feel like by moving you can connect socially with others. Because I think big part of moving to music is the social connection. Of course, you can also just dance alone in your room and just like blast some music and just like dance by yourself. But you definitely probably don't have that as much in new music either. It's just a different type of experience. Just like there's different types of food for different types of experiences, like you're not going to get like molecular gastronomy and, something that's really adventurous and out there. And you're like, oh, this looks like a bubble, but it's actually, like something, it's actually a steak, it's like something that really pushes our expectations and our understandings, our predictability. Like when you see something, you may not have an idea of what it's going to taste like. And I think this is wonderful and exciting as a culinary experience, but it's not the same thing as going to like a pizza place and getting a pizza where everyone shares. Like it's a different kind of experience, and they can coexist, and one doesn't have to be better than the other. They just are things that are different, that allow, as humans, we can enjoy the different types of predictability and the different types of expectations and roles. And I think music is the exact same way. I'm to go back to our earlier conversation, I am excited to see how science continues to as we learn more and more through scientific experiments and investigations, we do understand more about the brain, and I am excited to see how these things do impact what people create and how that influences how we, the art that emerges from it. But I'm also interested into seeing how our understanding of how we listen might influence our listening habits. Because I do think that people can change how they listen and how they appreciate something. So like this is maybe a sort of flippant example perhaps, but like if someone learns that dark chocolate is really good for you and can have positive health benefits, I'm very skeptical that there's a lot of benefits for that. But nonetheless, let's say that it does, and so that could influence how someone tastes and appreciates dark chocolate. Maybe they say, oh, it used to be really bitter, but now they're trying to understand it differently. And maybe if they learn why that bitter, or how the bitterness affects their tongue and their taste receptors and things, that it might have a change on them as an individual. And enough people do that, it might have a change on society. And so I think these kinds of things can exist in music too. And you see that happening in subtle ways all the time, even in like popular frameworks, like the appreciation of hip hop over time, and how that's evolved and changed in a larger cultural context, in a worldwide cultural context, especially.
Mm-hmm. And before you mentioned how relevant your participation, your engagement in the, let's say, neuroscience is relevant to your composition. And what crossed my mind was, what is relevance at that point? Does it necessarily have to be relevant in the way that it directly affects what you compose? Do you think there's a different type of relevance that can be traced there, that has nothing to do with what you will, what you will compose in the end? I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, in case you think I have some answers, but it's in the direction of to put it a bit jokingly, mathematics. Does it have any benefit to know math as someone that is a composer? What not directly affecting the composition. Does it have other benefits? And the same, or to expand in a messy way, still, like the Renaissance men, when they knew all these different disciplines at the same time. How do you see this in your case, since you do you are a person that has different disciplines, expertise?
Neža, are you calling me a Renaissance man?
I'm just kidding. Bringing up the notion also. Why? Because today everyone is speaking about interdisciplinary and everything. I mean, it's not new, right? To do that, and perhaps this notion, as we know it today, is even too limited at some points. So, yes, this is somewhere why one of the reasons why I'm interested in your position, your view of this. What is the relevance here, and what can we see as that meaning for someone that's composing today?
Okay, so I think there are three things that you asked. I'll try to go through each one. The first is about relevance and why and what I meant, and what I really mean is that the science that we study on the brain often doesn't have any bearing on the type of music or the how I approach music as a creator, as a composer. And so that's when I say relevance. It doesn't have relevance. It doesn't inspire, or it doesn't directly inspire. At least not yet. At least not often. Sometimes yes, but most of the times no. And the second thing about math, and does being knowledgeable of math and math concepts, could that be relevant to creating music? And I think absolutely yes. But I don't think it's because of math in particular. I don't think that math has more relevance than other things. Like as someone who has degrees in math and music, people say this all the time, like, oh, you have a degree in math and a degree in music? Oh, like that makes sense because they're so interconnected, and they're so, and I'm always like, it's true, they are really interconnected, but like really what isn't connected to math or to music? Almost everything is. I have feelings about these connections, and just in a nutshell, I think that when you look at the data, it is true that people who are professional mathematicians tend to play instruments and music statistically much more likely so than a random person. So mathematicians tend to are more likely to be musicians, which is like a pretty strong like argument for like there must be something there. But the interesting thing is it's not the other way around. Musicians that are professional musicians tend to be just as bad at math as the average person. It doesn't seem to help your understanding of math. And so what's going on there, and I think it's, my opinion is that it is just socioeconomics, that the people that tend to go into math tend to come from, statistically speaking, tend to come from higher earning families. Families that might be more likely to afford to have their kid get private lessons or have instruments in the home and have the ability and time to encourage, their child to play music and go to maybe a certain kind of school where they have better music programs and whatever. Like, I think these are the reasons that there's this historical connection, like Einstein's favorite thing to do was to play the viola in a string quartet, and these kinds of things. But there, of course, it is relevant, and there are connections, right? Like, absolutely. And you can, if you want to find patterns and connections, you will find it. And that's, I think, one of the glories of the human brain is that there are tons and tons of connections. I know I have been inspired by math so many times in my music, like directly. I have a piece called Goldbach that is based on the Goldbach conjecture, which deals with like the combinations of prime numbers. And I have a piece, my undergraduate thesis is called Four Colors, which is based on the four-color theorem from graph theory, and that which is a famous theorem that says that you only need four colors to color in a map of any kind. You can always just use four colors so that no borders will share the same color. There's always a way to color that in. And it was proven to have, you could do it with five colors, and that was proven a long time ago, but no one found a way to prove this theorem for a very long time until a computer did. It's one of the very first famous examples of a computer finding a proof for a theorem, and very controversially, and basically did it in a way that like looked at every single possible kinds of combinations of maps until there was nothing else left. And so it's not elegant at all, but it is a proof. It shows definitively that is a true statement. Anyway, so I based this piece on that. And so anyway, I have been inspired by math many times directly in my musical process. But I think this is true for almost any discipline. And about interdisciplinary studies and how this might, and its role or its usefulness and utility and how it might affect things as a composer or creator, I think that there are pros and cons to everything, and there are advantages and disadvantages to every approach. I have been someone that is interested in so many things. Like, I have split my time in so many ways because I'm like, oh, I love this thing, and I love this thing, and I love this thing. I'm that type of person who finds incredible wonder and fascination in so many different types of things that you could make a very easy argument that I am kind of a constant amateur, where I'm just, interested in all these disciplines that I never really devote all my time to one thing. Like, I say I'm a composer and I have a Ph.D. in it, but I don't spend as much time in music composition as many of my other colleagues, because I split my time with science, but I'm also involved in many other things that excite me. And so I'm like a true, cross-discipline or interdisciplinarian by nature. There are tremendous, for those that are young composers listening right now, thinking like how much time they should spend doing different things, I would say there's tremendous real world benefits to being devoted to your one special niche that you do, and devoting as much of your time and energy and efforts to that. Because if you are one of the top 10 people in your very specific niche in the world, you're very likely to get employed, and people will think of you as a tremendous resource, an expert, someone that is highly knowledgeable about this thing. We tend to appreciate the specialist. More so, at least financially speaking, and in terms of opportunities, than the person that is interested in diversity and in a range, a generalist. So yeah, generalist is the perfect way to say it. And I'm something of a generalist, to some degree. And the advantage of being a generalist is that I can synthesize. I can take the ideas from science and math and from other things, and all those things get infused into what I do as an artist, and what I do as an artist influences what I do as a scientist, and I can combine them in different ways. Like the negentropy project that you were involved with, that is something that you could really only do if you are a generalist to some degree, if you are interdisciplinarian. And so there's things that uniquely emerge by being involved in different fields or subdisciplines. And I'm someone who probably realized the real world risks of doing this approach probably much later in life than I probably should have. And I don't know if I would have, knowing it, how I would have done things differently if I could go back in time. It's so hard to say. But I do know that I took a harder path because of it, but not one that I regret at the same time, because it is who I am. I like being a generalist because I'm just so interested in so many things. It would be difficult for me, I think, to be as focused on just one something. But again, pros and cons. I think there's great utility in whatever approach. I probably would just say that to any young composer that might be listening to this, or that a young creator that might be listening to this, and that I would hope that they just try to really soul search and figure out who they are, what is their real interest, and why are they doing something, and follow that. So if that is like, oh, I really, really love this one thing, and that's what I really want to be doing, then do that. Just go for it, and just be as good as you can on it, devote as much time as you can on it. Even if that involves taking, financial risks, or living on a couch for some years or something, often that's the path to success in the field, a very difficult field like music. But if you're someone who likes a lot of different things, there's often a way to create a professional path that allows you to combine those things. And I wouldn't, I would only want to encourage that if someone really, really wants to do that.
Wonderful. And since we are now approaching the conclusion, I always ask for a message for any up-and-coming composers. So we already have that here. And the second message I always like to ask for is for anyone that will, after seeing this conversation, go and listen to your music. What would a short message for any one of those? When I'm asked to give a talk about my music, I almost always tend to include this piece called Lost. It's a piece I'm particularly proud of, and I think it's a great place to start with my music. And one of the things that I think it is so because it combines two things that I do in almost all of my music, two kind of artistic practices that kind of act as a through line through my works. And one of them is using historical models, so using pieces that already exist and basing my work on this usually old piece. So in this case, it's Thomas Tallis, The Lamentations of Jeremiah. It's an incredible masterpiece of the 15th century, 16th century. And
And so I base this piece on that, and in such a way that it can be performed like this, where it's like a section of Tallis followed by a section of me, and back and forth, Tallis, Rosenberg, and so it's a really great way to hear what I'm doing, and hear how I'm taking this old music and recontextualizing it and putting it through, like retranslating it through my own musical language, and then creating a piece. And so you can hear that transformation. And the second thing I do is I create this thing called dynamic systems. And dynamic systems is what I call this way of creating music such that there is an interplay between independence and collaboration. So in an ensemble setting, you have, instead of having a conductor that is leading everyone and everyone is following whatever the conductor is doing, instead of that, you might have that at times, but you often have things where the performers are leading in different ways, that everyone has to listen to someone in particular, or there's like factions that form, of almost quasi-political factions, where groups align and form a union and other groups challenge that, or there's a fascist, dictator that is telling everyone else what to do, or maybe there's anarchy and everyone's going on their own. And so there's all these dynamics.
Or string quartet number 1.
Like in string quartet number 1, you did your research. Yes, so exactly, just like that. And so that piece does that, but it also uses the musical language that is quite approachable, and because it's based on the Tallis, you can hear those influences. And so I think it's a great place to start. So if anyone is interested in listening to some of my music, it might be a good starting point.
Wonderful. At this point, thank you very much, Jason, for joining the conversation. And thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here.
Lovely.